Yo, we in the building. We in the building. Y'all let me know what it is. Y'all let me know what it is. We about to get into this my day. We gonna get into this information tonight. You know, we gonna get into it tonight regarding what's really going on. What's really going on with slavery, man? Everybody talking about that. I got my indigenuity, you know, busting down on us. You know what I'm saying? I got we got everybody coming at us, man. Okay, so no, so what we gonna do tonight? We gonna get into the whole slave myth about the indigenous people being brought this way and that way, and a lot of things that the indigenous community have been speaking on. We're gonna get into that and see if it makes a lot of sense. Okay, that's what we're gonna get into tonight. It's gonna shake somebody's tail. They're gonna be mad. They're gonna tell me this and that. But I'm just gonna break this down from the logic side, just like how they try to break it down from the logic side. Who am I meaning? I'm talking about the indigenous community, the way that they perceive slavery and present it. They it's coming from a different way than what we've been taught, and for good reason. I get it, but with that, it comes a lot of information that has to be dissected. It has to be tested and true. Okay. So we gonna get into that tonight, okay? Before we get into any of that, I need y'all to like. I need y'all to subscribe so that we can get our numbers up. You understand? If you go back and subscribe, and you know, if you guys want to donate, please feel free to donate. Okay, let me get back in the fold, man. I don't know why it dropped like that. I'm right here by the modem, y'all. I mean, I'm right by the modem. So I don't know what happened, but um, let's get back into this. Basically, what I'm saying is we need to break down a lot of what the indigenous community is saying about slavery because they're making certain claims. So what I have done tonight is I'm going to show you based on the data, okay? Just the data. We're gonna break this data down. See if we back up. All right. So let's see if it act right. Let's see if we act right. move it right next, so close to it. It's gonna be right sitting on the motor. All right. All right. So before, like I said, before we get into all that, I just wanted to show y'all my books. Y'all can check out these books on Amazon. All right. We're not gonna get too far into them. I did want to say something because this discussion tonight is dealing with Moors and Moorish. The Moorish with the MU versus the MO. Okay, we're talking about Moors, which was the Africans or the ones from the Alcabulan. Okay, those Moors, and then we're talking about the Moorish, which are the indigenous melanated people that were here. So I know this conversation is going to be deep because I have an understanding of both sides, and we're going to show the balance. But we're going to get this together, right? But like I said, these are all the other books. The latest book is The Canaanite Connection. Go check it out. The second Forest Treaty book, if you need a journal to write in, all that. So go check me out. Bandele El Amin on Amazon, all right? So we're going to get into this tonight. Let's get it cracking. Hopefully everything, we won't keep dropping the stuff. But what we're going to get into today, we're going to look at this slave trade because there's a lot of misconception. One of the things that I hear a lot is that the if so-called Albions, okay, what we call them the Europeans that came here, how could they have brought all those slaves? These are things that we have questions, right? How were all these slaves brought over here? And where are the ships? Where are the slave ships that brought these people over here? How could they bring over millions of people over here? Okay, that's the question. I mean, now I'm gonna say to you, they do say like what is it, 300 million? We're gonna look at that. We're gonna look at it, but I mean, they say like 300 million slaves were brought from Africa. Okay, and so that is what the indigenous people stand on when they're trying to make a disclaimer against the the more traditional understanding of slavery. And when we talk about slavery, y'all, we're talking about the Atlantic slave trade for the most part. Now, there was other slave trading going on in Africa on the eastern, from going to India. But for the most part, what we're dealing with is the Atlantic, alleged Atlantic slave trade. Because what a lot of indigenous people are saying is that it didn't even exist. Okay. Which that's where I think they're totally in fallacy. That's a fallacy. You know, I, I I do know that there are some things that have been said by the indigenous community though that do make sense, but for them to make that claim, we're gonna look at that. Okay, we're gonna get into that tonight. So I want, first of all, I want you to understand this. Now we're gonna look at this. It says the major Atlantic slave trading nations in order of trade value. So this is value. Okay, so Portugal had the most. They're saying that Portugal brought the most slaves. Britain, followed by Britain, Spain, France, Netherlands, the United States, and Denmark. So let's look at this. What we got? One, two, three, four, five. Netherlands. Then we got six, seven. So we talk about the slave trade. How could these people brought all these slaves over here? Well, the first thing I want to make it understood is that I don't want us to think about it was one group of Albions or so-called Europeans that brought slaves over. Because we often say, how could they, as in they were all in the same. Now, they were all, a lot of these were European countries, but they were not necessarily working together. They were all separate countries bringing, with their own capitalist mindset on how they was going to get this money. Okay, so we got All these different nations right here that were bringing slaves, bringing them either to America or taking them from America. Okay, let me check out what's going on in here, man, real quick though. I just want to see if anybody, because I know it's gonna get ugly in here, right? I know people are not going to want to hear this. Okay, but we got to look at this. We got to get into this. So we got those. We got those several countries. We got several countries to bring slaves over a span of 400 years. So it's like you're telling me that the Europeans couldn't bring uh, that many slaves over in 300 years? Like does anybody know how many slave ships was going back and forth? I'm just asking because they got all kind of stuff. They talk about seaworthiness. How could they bring that many slaves on the boat and die and not die? There's a lot of that going on, and I'm just here to give you the information so you can make a better, you know, a better judgment on what really went on instead of just going off of the so-called logic of how could this and do that, right? We're going to look at what they're saying, okay? Now, before we get into that, I want you guys to understand this is not an attack toward the indigenous community because there are melanated people in the Americas that were here long before the Europeans, okay? We're going to put that we're going to put that up, okay? We're going to put that up on the banner if I can pull it up, right? We're going to put that up here. This is from my understanding. Now, this is where, there's going to be some discrepancy per se about what it was, but African people came to America first. That's what needs to be overstood. That the first inhabitants to these land masses were dark skinned, melanated people. So I am not here to say that it's got to be either one way or the other. I'm not saying that it's got to be all Native Americans was here and they were all so-called black Negro colored now, or that they was melanated people, okay, that was here and they was the ones that were enslaved. I'm not gonna say that it was all indigenous people that were enslaved. What we're saying is that the indigenous people that first were here, I'm sure that Christopher Columbus and them encountered dark skinned people. We know this. Dark skin, they could have passed for what we look like. I mean, like our skin color, the hair texture, these things could have been true. Okay. Like we understand that dark skinned indigenous people were in America first. So I want that to be understood. Okay. So with that being said, let's look at this. And it's saying here that um, we want to look at Indian slavery in the Americas because there was what they call Indian or what we call indigenous or Native American. There was Native American slavery in the Americas. So, of course, did the European countries, when they came here, did they enslave the indigenous people that were here? Yes, they did enslave the native people of the Americas. Okay, starting from the first people, the Portuguese, coming over here with Christopher Columbus. They was first to bring and do that. So let's look at this. Let me just read a little bit of this to you, okay? Because we talk about the story of the European colonialism in the Americas and the victimization of Africans and Indians follows a central paradigm in most textbooks. The African role encompasses the transportation, the exploitation, and the suffering of many millions in New World slavery. While so called Indians are described in terms of succumbing in large numbers to disease, with the survivors facing disposition of their land. This paradigm, a basic one in the history of colonialism, omits a crucial aspect of the story. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were enslaved in large numbers. Okay, so this is what we need to know. This is what the indigenous community is speaking about. They're speaking about that the indigenous slavery is not spoken of. Okay, but the problem, I think, is that they go further to say that it was we were already here and they enslaved us, and so the ones the what we call the what people are called today as black or African American. They're saying that all the African Americans really are indigenous to the Americas. Okay, and they're saying there are very little number of Africans being brought here. That's the problem, is that they downplay the role of Africa in slavery. So what they've basically done is they reversed what was done to them, and they reversed it. Because as we as this first paragraph discusses, it says that they omit a crucial aspect of the history. So yes, they do not the European textbooks, European history does not discuss the indigenous people of the Americas being enslaved in large numbers. Okay. Now it says without slavery, slave trading, and other forms of unfree labor, the European colonialization would have remained extremely limited in the New World. The Spanish were mostly totally dependent on Indian labor in most of their colonies. And even where unfree labor did not predominate, as in the English colonies, it says colonial production was geared toward supporting the slave plantation complex of the West Indies. Thus, we must take a closer look at the scope of unfree labor, a central means by which Europeans generated the wealth that fostered the growth of colonies. So we understand that slavery funded their ability to grow and create, you know, colonies and different land masses, different states on the land. So, um, so with that being said, we also understand that the indigenous people, and at this particular point in this paragraph in this story, is that it was indigenous people predominant. We haven't really talked about Africans yet in this. It says that the modern perception of early modern slavery associate the institution almost solely with Africans and their descendants, right? Yet slavery was an ambiguous institution in an early modern world. It says Africans, Asians, Europeans, and Native Americans kept slaves before and after Columbus reached America. Enslavement meant a denial of freedom for the enslaved. But slavery varied greatly from place to place, as did the lives of slaves. The role of a slave soldier of the Ottoman Empire, who enjoyed numerous privileges and benefits, immensely different from the American Indian who worked in the silver mines of Peru, or the African who produced sugarcane in the Barbados. People could be kept as slaves for religious purposes. You see that? Or as a byproduct of warfare. So it says, in the wake of this in the indigenous Americas, the European conveyed microbes from which they had no immunity. The Spanish colonists turned to importing Africans. Okay, so let's go back to this. Let's go back to this because this is what I don't hear a lot of the indigenous community speak about, because they always talk about the uh, indigenous people being enslaved. And as this article points out, that is true. And I also happen to agree with this information as well, based on on my own information. But the thing about it is, it says, in the wake of the deaths of indigenous Americans, it says, from European conveyed microbes from which they had no immunity. So understand that coming to America, this place over here, with very little resistance to the filth of the Europeans. Let's just keep it real. Let's just understand it. The Europeans been on the boat and they stank, and it's disease. It's disease. I often speak about this, and I'm sure you've heard me say this before, but the first thing that gets off the boat when the European lands is rats. And rats carry disease. We understand that with the bubonic plague. If people understand Black Death was carried. Europeans didn't understand germs and things of that nature in this time. Back in bubonic plague days. So, as an example, the rats were bringing bubonic plague into Europe. So, in the same way, rats and whatnot, a lot of the animals that they brought over here themselves, brought smallpox. We understand that smallpox did decimate, and see, that's something that they like. I don't want to hear that was fake. You got to prove to me that was fake, because at the same time, it's like, where do we go? We talk about how the European was so diabolical and did things that no other people had done on a level of slavery, but yet you don't think that they would have. You don't look at their filth. Like, come on, they get off the boat, rotten teeth. You smelling. A lot of them got diseased, and they're getting off the boat, and they're spreading that among a population that really can't deal with it. So it talks about that. So because of that, the Spanish start importing Africans. So early, like, think about the Spanish colonists started importing these Africans. So now it says, a racist and gross misinterpretation of this event, okay, that most Indians could not be enslaved because of their love for freedom, while Africans were used to having their labor controlled by big men in Africa. This dangerous view obscured a basic fact of every modern history. Listen, it's saying anyone can be enslaved. Over a million Europeans were held as slaves from 1530s through 1780s in Africa, which we talk about that because the Ottoman Empire, and the Moorish people, pirates, which were a lot of the pirates were Moors, were enslaving what they call free white Christians, or Christians, right? And usually when they talk about Christians in that day, they were definitely talking about what we call so-called white people. Okay, so the Ottoman Empire kept slaves as well, right? John Smith had been a slave by the Ottomans before he obtained his freedom to help colonize Virginia. So it says in 1650, more English were enslaved in Africa than Africans enslaved in English colonies. So we're talking about 1650. If we really want to talk about slavery, and we really want to talk about what's going on, we got to look at this all the way because it wasn't just about the indigenous people, right? This slave trade was big and everybody was involved and everybody was being enslaved. Um, a lot of European, like let's say, like in Britain, if you commit a crime, you were sent off to hard labor in America colonies. Okay, so these countries were looking for any way to have free labor, and the importing of Africans began to happen pretty early in slavery. Okay, so it says the United States were enslaved in North Africa as the pro-slavery idea by George Fitzhugh noted in the book Cannibals All. In the history of world slavery, Europeans were commonly the ones held as slaves, and the enslavement of Africans was relatively new historical development. Not until the 18th century did the words slave and African become synonymous in the minds of Europeans and Euro Americans. Okay, so we're talking about that there was everybody being enslaved. Okay, so like I said, I gotta say this because we are under the assumption that it was all black people and or indigenous people. It was all black indigenous. It was a lot of slavery going on both sides. Okay, so like I said, just to keep it going, it says the European trade in American Indians was initiated by Columbus. Okay, so we understand that Columbus, needing money to pay the world for the New World expeditions, he shipped Indians to Spain. So this is where the indigenous people talk about how actually it was the other way around. They try to say um, that it wasn't any Africans that were brought to America, or it was so low of a number, but it was more so that they shipped the indigenous people to Europe or Africa. Okay, so they were saying there was a lot of that going on. And, I remember that being spoken about in history a little bit, but, this does, bring that back up. But this is where they get that whole notion. Okay, so let's look at it in its wholeness. Okay, it says that he shipped Indians to Spain. But look, he says where they already existed slave markets, okay, dealing and buying and selling of Africans. Okay, so indigenous people were being brought over to Africa and other places in Europe because they had already set up slave trade. They had already, like, people don't realize, and if you read John Henry Clark's book on Columbus and the Holocaust, I can't remember the exact name. It was Columbus and the Holocaust, something to that effect, right? But if you look at that book, it talks about how Christopher Columbus was going up and down the seas, at least 20 years before he made his voyage to the Americas. They were setting up the slave route back then. It was, and I'm not saying that they weren't, they planning this out. Like they making these moves, and they actually kind of planning out what they was trying to do. Okay, so moving on. Okay, it says within a few decades, the Spanish expanded the slave trade in American Indians from the island of Hispaniola to Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Cuba, and Bahamas. Okay, the great decline in the indigenous island population, which largely owed to disease, right? Slaving and warfare, led the Spanish to then raid Indian communities in Central America and many of the Indians just off the continent. It's okay. Now listen, it says around 650,000 Indians in the coastal Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Honduras were enslaved in the 16th century. So think about it, 650,000. The conquistadors then entered the inland American continents and continued the process. Hernando, yeah, we know about him for instance, brought with him iron implements to enslave the people of La Florida on his famous expedition through the American Southwest unto the Carolinas and west of the Mississippi Valley. Indians were used by the conquistadors as tamims to carry their goods on these distant forays. Another form of Spanish enslavement of Indians in the Americas was, I'm not sure how you would say that. I would say Yani Kanaje, which was similar to a European serfdom, whereby Indians were tied to particular specific lands to labor rather than lords. And under a encomienda system, Indians were first forced to labor or pay tribute. Okay. It says by 1542, the Spanish had outlawed outright slavery of some, but not all Indians. So look at that. In 1542, Spanish had outlawed the outright enslavement. The outright. So you know what that means. Like, so they were making an effort to, do something about slavery, but it still was being used um, probably under, like in a black market, if you will. It says, or even better, that a lot of Indians would be classified as black or of African so that they could continue to enslave them. Now, that is my thoughts, but I'm going to keep on reading. It says people labeled cannibals could still be enslaved. Okay, so the loophole was if the Indians were cannibals, that they could still be enslaved. Okay, it says as could Indians purchase from other Europeans or from Indians. So indigenous people were selling other indigenous people into slavery. That's something else that we don't talk about. That indigenous community, the indigenous population also practiced in slavery and would capture other nations or other tribes and, capture them for a slave. So, um, these things have to be considered as well. We often romanticize who we are. We romanticize Moors, we romanticize being indigenous, and we romanticize being African. But at the same time, that all these people also played a part in their own detriment. Okay, so um, let's see. Let's go here. Even in regions where African slavery predominated, such as the sugar plantations in Portuguese Brazil and in the West Indies, Indian labor continued to be used. As in many Spanish colonies where the plantation did not flourish, Indians provided the bulk of unfree labor through a colonial era. In other words, the growth of African slavery in the New World did not diminish the use of unfree Indian labor, particularly outside the plantation system. So we have both. And that's what I'm trying to get across. They had both. You had African slavery, Spanish slavery. I mean, indigenous slavery. The indigenous people were not able to deal with the disease, and they did not last as long on the, like, for example, sugar plantation. We might look at that, but like usually, if you like the going time survival rate in a plantation on a sugar plantation might have been like 5, 6 years for an African, but for a indigenous, it was only 3 or 4. And so when you start looking at how much more production you get out of that African for 2 more years, how much more money is being made or profit from that, it began to also be a money thing. That it was cheaper to get African slaves and have them do certain work, and then have the Indian native, I call them Native American, the natives, have them do a different type of particular work that was not necessarily part of the plantation. Okay, so it's saying whereas in South Africa, South America, and the islands, Europeans conducted a bulk of slavery raids against the Indians. Okay, except in Brazil, where there was mixed blood. But it says much of the enslavement of Indians in North America above Mexico was done by Indians. You hear that? Much of the enslavement of Indians in North America above Mexico was done by Indians. North American Europeans did enslave Indians during wars, okay, especially in New England, okay, and the Southeast, right? Everybody know about the Yamasees and all them, right? Okay, it said, and there was a lot of wars, as you see, right? But ordinarily, Europeans, especially the English and French, purchased their Indian slaves from Indians. Now, that's very interesting. That's very interesting. Okay? They purchased them from other Native Americans. Indians slaved against not only their enemies, but Indians they had never met. Many Indians that recognized they had little choice but to become slavers. If they did not do the European bidding, they could easily become victimized themselves. It was not unusual for peoples victimized by slavery to become slavers, and for those who had been slavers to become the objects of raids. So it was sad, but it's like they almost had to do that in order not to be caught up. It reminds me of what happened in Africa as well, because they did the same thing. You got Africans going in, enslaving their own people, bringing them out. So the concept is the same. The colonialists, they had a particular tactic that they used. Okay. Now to keep on reading, slavery against Indians did begin to decline in the East in the second quarter of the 18th century, largely as a result of Indians' refusal to participate in large-scale slaving raids. But the trade moved westward, so they were still like trying to, enslave certain people in North America. Okay, the Comanche, or the Apache, uh, from Louisiana to Mexico, large-scale enslavement of American Indians persisted into the 19th century. Slave markets were held monthly. Okay, so I I just want you guys to understand that there was slavery among the indigenous people. The indigenous people are correct in that particular aspect of when they speak about indigenous people, okay, and being enslaved. Um, and I would even go as far as to say that it was more than what they were saying. I mean, like they say it was 600. What was it, 650,000 that they had, and 1500s, right? Where was that at? Um, where was it? I know it says something like, okay, yeah, it said about 650,000, right? And that was like in 1493. So I mean, not 1493, but somewhere in the 1500s, I believe, right? So if they had that many by then. I mean, there were millions of indigenous slaves, millions, right? So let us give that credit, and so we don't have that argument no more. Because this is not about just totally like trying to dismiss what the indigenous people are saying. I'm not trying to dismiss it. Okay, I just got to put it in a better perspective because a lot of indigenous people are trying to discredit all African stuff just as a way of trying to say that it was this way and discrediting things that are actually there that shows that there were Africans, a lot of Africans brought here. And I'm going to show you basically how they looked at it when I'm talking about a lot of Africans, okay? So now let's look at this again, right? I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back real quick, man. Let's see how many of you in the building, man. Let's go back, man. Ain't nobody probably in here. Okay, so let's see what's going on. Let's see what's going on. All right, so I'm going back to the screen real quick, right? We're going to look at these groups because, like I said, there were several countries, okay, several European countries that participated in the slave trade. So let's not group let's not group them all together and just say, oh, them Europeans couldn't bring all them over here. Oh, they couldn't bring all them over here. Let us look at what they say they brought over here individually. Okay, let's look at them. So we're gonna look at each one. We're gonna look at Portugal first. Okay, let's look at Portugal if it's up now. It says Portugal confronts its slave trade past. So right there. So right here, we got Portugal speaking about race and history, about the slave trade. This is in Lisbon. Okay, over 5 centuries. Okay, we're talking about 500 years ago. After it launched the African slave trade. So let us learn who the Portuguese were the first ones to really launch this trade off. Portugal is preparing to build a memorial, okay, for millions of Africans. Okay, millions of Africans its ships carried into bondage. Okay, millions of Africans. City of Lisbon voted to build it. Blah blah blah. Okay, let's keep on. Let's keep going. Listen, listen. Look at it. Look at it. Look at it. Look at it. It says the Portuguese vessels carried an estimated 5.8 million Africans into slavery. So we talking about just the Portuguese themselves. We're not talking about any other European countries right now. Just the Portuguese, right? And they said, like, look, let's go back. Let's go back. Let's go back. It says the major slave trade nations in order of trade value. The first one is Portugal. So Portugal was the one that brought the most slaves over here. They was the ones that brought the most slaves over here. Okay? Look. Look at this. Look at it. Look at it. It says the Atlantic slave trade started in 1444. Okay? When 235 people snatched from the newly discovered coast of West Africa were put up for sale in Lagos. Okay? now a laid back Portuguese beach resort in Europe's southern western tip. So we know that the Portuguese was in there. They still in there today. So the influence, we know they've been there. 1444. We talking about 50 years before Christopher Columbus sailed to America. So they were already setting up the slave trade in from Europe to Africa already. They already had it. It was already being perfected. You are in 1444, bro. Like, I just people need to stop with the whole thing about Africans not being enslaved like that. They got to stop. Y'all got to stop. It's not, that is not the narrative. You can't take away what happened with the Africans, and this right here sets up what's going to happen with the Americans and the slaving going on to the Americans. Okay, it's setting it up. So the Portuguese, 5.8 million Africans into slavery. Look, it says most went to Brazil, a Portuguese colony until 1822. So this is another thing because um, we got a lot of people who claim and say like, well, I'm not from Africa, right? Because my great grandmother or great grandmother is from South America. You know, they're from different places like that. Now, like they said, most of them went to Brazil. Brazil has the biggest melanated African of people in the world outside of Africa. That's what they say. Now, we know about the whole thing about oh the European the American whites. Okay, let's just make it plain. The American whites and what they did in America with slavery was a little bit different in how other places did. So America basically later, and later on, like because we talking about at least 200 years after Portuguese, right? The Americans basically seeing what was going on with slavery, they kind of tried to modify how they was going to deal with it in America. So, you know, they may not have carried as many slaves, which I think a lot of times when we talk about indigenous people saying there wasn't that many brought over here, look, we're talking about how many Africans was brought to this side of the hemisphere. We're not talking about how many that made it to America, like the United States. We're not talking about just the United States. We're talking about North, Central, and South Americas. They had slavery, and then not to forget the islands, the Caribbean. These places were populated with a lot of African slaves. Okay, so we see right here that the Portuguese was enslaving in 1444. All right, well, let's keep pushing. Bones tell the story of African slaves in Spanish colonies. The bones of slaves carried from Africa to the Americas by Spaniards carry the record of both their mistreatment, okay, of their captors and the pathogens they carried with them to the New World. Okay, so they showing you through the genetic analysis the remains of three Africans enslaved in Spain. So we know they was doing that. We know they was enslaving Africans. We know they were enslaving Moors. Okay? We know they kicked the Moors out. And we know that a lot of those Moors became enslaved. Okay? So we talking about Spain, Portuguese. Okay? We got Portugal and Spain. If y'all know y'all geometry, Portugal is right there on the southern tip of Spain. Okay? Or at least on the south western side of Spain, right? What I'm saying is they like right here as nations. Okay, they're like right borders. They border each other. Okay, so Spain is talking about slave trade of Africans. Now we had the Portuguese that had that many. They said, look, from the slave trade beginnings in the 15th century, Spain, to its collapse in the 19th century, between 10 to 19 million Africans were enslaved and forcibly deported to the Americas and to Caribbean colonies. So Americas, we're talking about North, Central, and South Americas to the Caribbean colonies. Between 9 and 15 million survived the journey to the so-called New Worlds. You see, so-called, right? Where disease and conquest had already decimated close to 90% of the indigenous population, according to the study. So we're talking about the indigenous people being enslaved, and then they kind of got worn out, and their population dwindled. Not, I'm not saying they got extinct. But what I'm saying is that they noticed the population, so they had to repopulate. Okay, it says using a combination of genetic, what's this, osteological, and isotope analysis on bones. Look, recovered in Mexico, researchers set out a portrait of enslaved Africans lives in the Americas. Okay, now I know they're gonna be like, oh, they just trying to twist it and say that that those people were African, but they really probably was slaves because we all from America. Okay, that's what y'all gonna say. But this is that is a story. We're looking at what the genetics say. Okay, their genetics, um, the genetics suggests they were born in Africa, where they spent all of their youth. Okay, our evidence points to either a southern or western African origin before being transported to the Americas. From these bone analysis, researchers have developed an understanding of the physical hardships people experience. Okay, so I'm showing you this because they're showing you that these were African people being brought over here. So yes, Africans were brought over to the Americas, and there were a lot of them brought over here. How they bring them over here? How they ships? It's cold in there, man. Come on, we gonna keep getting into this. We gonna keep getting in it. We gonna dig into this. All right, we gonna break down this stuff. Let's get it. All right, let's get it. Y'all give a thumbs up, please. Like this video, right? Please subscribe to the channel, right? Let's build this channel up. Let's go. You guys, let's see what we talking about. What we talking about right here? Okay, after Portugal, I ain't even got in Great Britain. Look, France was the third most active power involved in the slave trade. So that's what I'm trying to tell y'all. It was several different countries with their own resources. Okay, all of them had their own resources. It wasn't no big group of them doing it all at once together. They were all in competition against each other. Look at the French. Now the French said between look, we talking about between 1551 and 1875. So we talking about look, from 1851, I mean from 1551 to 1851 is what? 300 years. So we talking about like what, 324 years or something like that, right? We talking about 324 years. So this is what I want to add. You telling me that they could not ship 1 million people in 300 years? You telling me that The boats was so dainty and so bad that they couldn't bring a million slaves in 300 years. Come on, man, 300 years. Y'all think about how long 300 years is. Just think about how long 300 years is. How many ships do you think it took? Look. Let's look at it. Let's keep on going. Let's look at it. It says African people were transported by force, okay, on ships flying the French flag, according to the Slave Voyages database. So y'all can go look that up. Let's look it up. Y'all can look this stuff up to try to debunk it. I have no problem with that. I'm just showing you what's going on instead of just the talk, right? It says that with these, look, 4,118 crossings that they had on record. France was reasonable for 11% of the transatlantic slave trade. So France by itself was 11%, which total affected more than about 12.5 million men, women, and children. Okay? They was making that bread. They was making that bread. Y'all can't tell me that them Europeans aren't greedy. You telling me that they ain't not greedy? That they wouldn't, that for the love of money and fortune, have they not shown you throughout history that they are willing to go beyond to get the gold, to get the money, to get the wealth, to get the fortune, to get the resources? Have they not shown you what they are what they want to do, what they'll do? Okay? It says the first French slave trading voyage dates back to the second half of the 16th century. Started in the 1600s, right? Louis the 13th began issuing letters patent to Norman blah 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 to conduct business in the West Africa. Although he did not normally authorize the slave trade until later, in order to support the French Caribbean islands, three monopoly trading companies. Okay, the West Indies Company. Look, the West Indies Company. Now I want to talk about this because this is something that we need to discuss, and the fact that you have these big companies like West Indies Company was a big company, and they were into importing, meaning shipping. Okay, and so what the hell do you think the West Indies Company was shipping? Huh? You think it were, huh? Like they were shipping slaves, sugar. Bring over some, bring over some African slaves, or enslaving the indigenous population, and then sending the sugar and the dope back over to Europe. Because that's something else we're gonna talk about. And I'm not getting into all that, but you know, all this was for dope. Now I want you to think about something. Sugar was the main staple, one of the main staples. Okay, one of them. We had sugar, right? Tobacco, alcohol. Okay, you had of all three of these things, along, when we talk about slavery in America, like in the United States, we always just talk about cotton, but that's not the major reason slaves was brought over here. The Spanish and the Portuguese and all them was uh, bringing Africans and enslaving the indigenous people for sugar, which was and is today probably the biggest selling drug in the world. So if you look at it like that, when you got people now who's doing bringing the Colombians and all them that are well, not just Colombians, but like Central and Central America, different gang or affiliate organizations that are doing bringing in heavy drugs now. Like you got a lot of fentanyl, and cocaine and all these different things that these people will not stop. You can't stop them from selling it because it's such a commodity. It's such a big market of money that these people will risk their lives to sell this dope. They'll risk their lives to sell fentanyl and all that, right? So, can you imagine with sugar and tobacco that those were the biggest drugs? Alcohol, biggest drugs of that time. They was slanging dope, and it was big money. So I think they would do pretty much anything they need to do to fulfill to fulfill the need. So yeah, okay. I'm not gonna go all into this because it's a lot. It's a lot going on. Let me go back and see what's going on in the question, man. See if anybody on here, right? Okay, so um, I do want to put this up here. Let me see. So we got okay. Okay, so this is another group. Okay, because this is a group that we don't talk about. This is a group of people that we don't talk about, and that is the Danish. Like we don't like most people don't even know the Danish was involved. And to keep it real with you, the Danish was a major player in the slave trade, and like many people don't know this. And I don't want to digress, but I just want to show you the scope of Danish, the Danish influence on the world. I just gotta back up. The Danish people, the world currency, like today, like if you look at today, the world currency is the American dollar, right? And before the Americans dominated, it was Britain. Britain had the world currency, right? So let's go back before Britain, it was the Danish that had the world currency. So I just wanted to put that in perspective, okay? Danish decision to abolish the transatlantic slave trade in 1792. So look, from 1650s onward, Denmark, right? Denmark, the Danish, Denmark, what they call the Netherlands, right? Participated in the slave trade. A total of 120,000 enslaved Africans transported from Africa to the West Indies on a ship flying a flag of Denmark. Okay, on the other hand, Denmark was the first slave trading nation that prohibited this barbaric traffic. So, they made a couple of dollars off of it and then they got out of it and condemned it. You know what I'm saying? So, despite their active slave trading, there was largely no public debate about the subject of Denmark for many years. Okay, so I'm not gonna get into it. It says in 1791 he commissioned and established to secure a better arrangement for trade in blacks. So I mean, like these people, the Danish is over here in Europe. It's over there in Europe. They, they had more access to Africa and bringing them slaves because you got to think about this. I know that it looked like they go from America all the way over to Africa to bring some slaves, but they're not really doing that. It's like most of the most of these are European countries, and they're already over there with Africa. So it's like, well, let me go down here, boom, grab these Africans, and then take them over to America. It was like more of that than it would be. I'm going to go to America first, then come back and pick up some Africans, then go back. It wasn't like that. Usually, they're bringing the slaves over because they coming from Europe. They coming from Europe, and then all they would do is get to Africa. Predominantly, if they would get to like Morocco, which is at the top of Africa, and if they would just hit that coastline and just stay on that coastline pretty much all the way down, they could pretty much get to West Africa. just by you know staying on the coastline, and that's what they did. So most of these European countries had no problem with getting to Africa. It wouldn't have been hard to get there. And this is and we're seeing it. Like we're just seeing all these countries. That's what I'm saying. Like you have 6, 7 countries, European countries that was involved in slavery over a period of 300 years. So you got like I said, you got 6, 7 European nations all scrambling for slaves. So let's look. You see, the trade on blacks. As a result of that trade, you say it said its slave population grew from 28 to 36, right? Under the transatlantic slave trading under the Danish flag. So I mean, come on. We talking about the Danish. Look, slavery in Dutch American and West Indies. So we got the Dutch, right? The Dutch. It said at the height of slavery during the last quarter of the 18th century, there were over 150,000 slaves in Dutch Atlantic settlements. So I mean, like everybody think about it, the Dutch wasn't even that big. Matter of fact, I want to make a correction. I believe it was the Dutch. It was the Dutch that had the world currency. Okay, it was not the Danish. I got them confused. But I think it was the Dutch. Okay, but I know that these countries were very wealthy in Northern Europe. Okay, very wealthy countries, and they had their hand in slavery. Look, shipped over 600,000 enslaved Africans. Over 600,000. Just them. Just them themselves. Over 300 years. So let's say this. Oh, you could have brought all those people. It would have depopulated the Africa, and it did depopulate Africa. But we're talking about over a period of 300 years. We're not talking about like them going in and taking millions in one year, per se, right? Like they're not taking 300 million Africans from one region in one year. It's a gradually over 300 years. These different groups hit up different areas of West Africa. You know, not just one spot in West Africa. They hit up several spots in West Africa. They had some stuff going down in South Africa. Okay, there was a lot of trading going on around Africa. It says as a result of the large empire of its East Indies in the 19th and 20th century. So Dutch had a large empire. Okay, that's what I'm saying. Like these countries that you didn't think about, they blew up off of slaves. Like they blew up. They said they had a very large empire. Now, how you get a large empire if you don't have wealth? And where did they get the wealth? The wealth was off of slave trade. They blew up all these different like all these European countries began to become wealthy and begun to grow and become militarily strong because they started enslaving and started making money. They start. It's like um, when we talk about the CIA funding the drugs to melanated men in the 1980s. Like we got the show Snowfall as an example. You know, we got Rick the real Rick Freeway. You know, these type guys and other that all got caught up in them selling dope to them to make money so they could fund something else. So when we look at these Europeans, they were making all this money from rum, like alcohol, tobacco, sugar. You know, they're making money off of these drugs because the wealthy people wanted it. You know, wealthy people had the money to buy the sugar. If you look at sugar in European history, sugar it was so popular, and they would rot their teeth. Like it, the wealthy ate so much sugar that it rotted their teeth, and it was seen as a status symbol because Europeans looked at the wealthy and said, "Oh, the wealthy got bad teeth. We're gonna make our teeth look bad because it makes us look like we're rich or wealthy. If you got bad teeth, you must be wealthy." Which is kind of like the opposite of today because if you notice that drugs, if you look at the drugs of the day, like if you look at predominantly like crack or crack cocaine, which is cocaine, and even like methamphetamine, right? You got meth or ice, right? They rot your teeth out. You know what I'm saying? Like a lot of these drugs rot your teeth. So these people walking around looking like addicts, eating sugar, and all this money being made. You know, see what I'm saying? Because we talking about in the Caribbean. This is where the sugar cane was at in the Caribbean. That's where it was best. It could grow the best. Okay, so we got the Dutch, we got the Danish, we got French. Okay, we got all them. I ain't even got into English yet. I think I might have missed the English. Right? I might have missed the English. I might have to pull them up though. Right? Okay, here we go. Let's look at the British slavery and the British transatlantic. So, right, let's look at it. Let's look at it. The guide covers records created throughout the trade from the 16th to the 19th century. Okay, a brief introduction to the slave trade and the abolition. So let's just keep going. It said right here, the British was one of the most successful. You hear that? Most successful slave trading countries, together with Portugal. Okay, Portugal. The two countries accounted for about 70%. Listen, of all Africans transported to the Americas. So Portugal and and Britain. So for all of our indigenous people and these things of that nature that speak about this, let us look at literature and evidence of Britain's slave and look at Portugal's slave trade. They are 70%. It is estimated that Britain transported 3.1 million Africans, okay, to the Caribbean, North and South America. Okay, so I just want to show you that. So I mean, y'all need to y'all do the math, do the freaking math. All these different countries importing their own amount, what they're saying that they brought, right? You guys, all those numbers are off. I mean, my thing is, let's prove that. Let's look at that and prove it then, right? Right? Let's read it. Let's prove it. So we got them all, right? Let's look. Let's keep looking. Let's keep looking. Because a lot of people say, like, let's talk about the slave ships, okay? Let's talk about the slave ships. Are any slave ships? There ain't no slave ships, right? Let's look at slave ships. The sunken slave ship, over 150 years ago, have passed since the last slave ship across the Atlantic. In 1860, enslaving black people was still legal, though it was immoral in the United States. But kidnapping people from Africa was still legal. Okay. So now I know people are gonna talk about this one because this is the one we talk about, but some people don't know about this one. They talk about the Clotilda, or the Clotilda. Okay, smuggled African captives in the 1860s. The captain burned and sank the ship to hide the fact that it was illegally brought enslaved people to the United States more than 50 years after slave trade had been made illegal. So I just want to show you this. This is in the United States, and this ship was a ship that was at, well after slavery, bringing slaves from Africa was made illegal. But 1860s slavery was still legal. You just couldn't bring them from Africa. So um, I think this is important. This particular one is important because it also shows you what the captain did. Like I don't think that after a while having any slave ships was uh, permitted in the United States. Like if you was caught with a slave ship, you would be um, you know in trouble. So it was illegal. So I think a lot of the ships physically were burned or destroyed. He destroyed this ship and burnt it and sank it so he wouldn't get in trouble. Okay, but this was a ship. This is accounted as a slave ship. Now, I showed this one ship because you're like, oh, that's just one ship. I just wanted to show a ship. I'm going to put one on your mind, okay? So you can look it up yourself. But I wanted to show, which is the last part of this, I wanted to show a list of slave ships. So, I mean, like, if you wikied it, you know what I mean? A list of slave ships. Now, it says that it lacks sufficient corresponding inline citations. So I mean, like, there's always more to be put on here, right? But he said this is a list of the slave ships. I think they try to put them in alphabetical order. But these were ships used to carry enslaved people, mainly in the Atlantic slave trade. Okay, so we got Abby. Look, I mean, man, this is gonna take forever, right here. Abby was 98 tons, sailed from May 1796. The French captured the Abby. She embarked her captives. She arrived at what's the name? 100. Okay, so look, one thing they talk about, they don't, how many captives was on the ship. You couldn't put that many people on the ship. Okay, there was different ships, different sizes. Okay, my question is that if you had 199 captives, there could have probably been more on there. There probably was more captives on that ship, but a lot of them would have died on the way here. Okay. Um, so we got Abby. Abby was built in 13 colors in 1774, 154 tons. Okay. So you got the Abbey ship. You got the Aggie ship, right? Launched in Liverpool in 1777. She traded locally into 1781 when her owners renamed her Spy and placed her in the slave trade. Okay. The French Navy captured her in 1782 in the West Indies as she was arriving to deliver her cargo of enslaved people. Okay? I mean, so you got a lot of this going on. Ajax. I mean, look at all these ships. Albania. Okay? Look, made one voyage to the Gold Coast, Kingston, Jamaica. There was 178 slaves. Okay? Batavia. This ship was from the Antelope. Captured in 1797. Right? On the way to Grenada. Like a lot of them, and like now the thing about this, these are the ships that were for real caught. Like these were the ones that were pretty much captured, so they were on record. So I just want you to think about when we get done with this list because this is a decent sized list, and these were just the captured ships. So this whole notion that there ain't no ships out here or there we don't put no names to the ships. We don't think because when we do that then we could very easily say, oh, there wasn't no ships. You know they could have did all that. Well, let's keep looking. All right, let's keep looking. Look, because I want to show you the number. This is the second Antelope, was a Spanish ship. It was captured. So most, like I said, most of these ships are on here that were captured near Florida with 283 captives. Okay. How many times how many times has that Spanish ship had sailed? It says 1802 slave ship, and it said it was captured in 1820. So it had been sailing for how long? Do the math. You got 18. So this ship was sailing in hypothetically, I ain't saying every year, but for it was in use for 18 years before it got captured. How many voyages did that one ship Antelope um, make? So I'm just saying, like, you guys got to think about that. Then we got the La Amistad. Everybody know about that, the movie, right? The Back House was launched in Chester. It was initially sailed as in West Indian. So I mean, like, I'm just saying, the Back House 2 was launched in right, captured in 1810 as she was returning to Britain. Was returning to Britain from Brazil. So okay, this one could have been 1798. That could have been indigenous people, being brought over here. I'm not saying that they weren't. We already we have already made that claim too, that Native Americans was being brought too. But a lot of these ships that we said so far are the ones being brought from like Europe to um, from Africa to the United States, or to somewhere in the America, right? So let's keep looking, right? Um, I'm just trying to look for these numbers on here for you. You know what I'm saying? Because when I look through, I'm like, dang. I mean, look at all these ships though, from New Brunswick, Liverpool, right? The Caroline was a Portuguese, right? That's what I'm saying. Like, look at all these ships from different ones. They got the one we talked about, right? Look, we just in the seas. We just in the letter C. D look, look at all these Royal Island ships from the African coast in 1775. Brought the first slaves to Louisiana. Was launched at Bermuda, launched in Lancaster, right? So I'm just saying, look, I mean, look at all these ships. Look at all these ships. That's what I'm saying. Like, look, this is we just in the F's. 134 Africans captured. Look at all these. Look, this cargo had 477 to 482 captives were condemned. So I mean, like, they would have ships that would be like 500 on there. This one had 529 on board. So let's think, if you got, I just want y'all to understand. If you got, okay, I'm gonna pick a day. Let's say 40s or 50s, right? The French was bringing slaves over on its own, right? Britain was bringing slaves. How many of these ships were sailing from each country in a year? With 500, 300 to 500 captives on them. How many you think it was doing? How many you think was being brought over here? How many do you think that each country could bring? We already looked at the numbers. 400 Angolians, Portuguese ship. So I'm saying Portuguese was heavy in it. Okay, 150 Africans, right? 250 Africans carried 348, 206, 400 captured. See what I'm saying? So look, we just in the L. So I'm just look at this. Look at all these ships. In 1576, John Hopkins captured this ship and transported 400 Africans. And I'm gonna tell you something else. It was a lot of like you got pirates and all that going on. It was a lot of people were stealing other like slave ships. You know, they selling for a country or for a company, and they get hijacked. There's a lot of that was going on. You see what I'm saying? Look, this one had over 800 slaves abroad. I mean, aboard. I'm sorry. Had 800 slaves aboard, right? So I'm talking about, come on, 800 slaves, okay? 800 slaves on that ship. So just think if you had ships that was selling like that had 800 on the ship. How you get 800 on a ship? Spanish ship carried 485. Come on. Look, I can't stop. Dang. I mean, come on, look at all these. I'm not even going to go through all these, y'all. I just want you to see. Look at this one. American built, captured by U.S. Yorktown on December 1845 with 850 to 900 slaves. 440 slaves. So I want you to understand this too. A lot of slaves were being brought to the South America because of Portugal and Spain. They were bringing slaves up that way. Even the Americas. America had ships, and then they would sail because you couldn't bring them back to America because it was illegal after 1800s, right? So a lot of them would just sail to South America, and then they would bring them up from there because once they're on land, they could be easily sit here. So then you could just say, "Oh, I'm bringing slaves from Brazil to the Caribbean, Jamaica, what they call Hispaniola, all that stuff. That area, you know, they just bring them up to the islands, and then the Americans could go down there and buy them and bring them back. So you have a lot of that going on. But I'm just showing you 400 slaves here. It wasn't like 2, 3 slaves on the ship, and they couldn't bring. Man, they was bringing because you got to think about it, they got cargo. They got enough room to carry a lot of stuff in a lot of these boats. Like they were bringing animals over here. They were bringing whole groups of animals on a boat. And I ain't talking about Noah and stuff like that. I'm talking about like they were bringing pigs, horses, cows, all kind of stuff. You know what I'm saying? And they were bringing food. They could bring all that over there. So I mean, like they had room to put, groups of people on these ships. What they eat? Oh, I mean, like a lot of rice. Like you got to think about rice. Rice doesn't spoil. You can feed people with rice, big bags of rice, store that, right? Give them just enough to eat, just enough, right? Y'all act like they was too slow to come up with a plan to get this money. That's what they act like. They act like they're too slow. Like, nah, they couldn't have brought them over here. Look at all these ships launched from London. So I mean, like a lot of these ships was created in Europe and was sent to Africa, then to Americas. Look, I mean, I'm just showing you. Look at all these ships. Formerly last slave ship to the U.S. So I mean, that's what I'm saying. All these ships, even in America, that wasn't supposed to be. Now this one was interesting too to me, right here. A ship that transported cargo, passenger, and slave, captured by a pirate. So that's what I'm saying. Like you had pirates that would capture these ships too. So let's look at that. You know what I'm saying? Just look at that. Y'all go, do a look on yourself. But I just wanted to show you this. I just want to show you how many, like, these are all the ships they captured. This ain't even all the ships that were doing this. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, like, there were a lot of slave ships. Where are all these slave ships today? Man, who knows? Like, the thing about it is, I don't see many ships in general from that time frame. But because of that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It's like how the Europeans get here then. How the Europeans get here? You know, how many of them was on the Mayflower? You see what I'm saying? It was like at least 100 on the Mayflower. So I mean, there was an ability to bring, you know, hundreds or on a boat for a certain time. Oh, it was talking about it was cold. The weather was cold. This was cold. If it was that cold, like how could anybody survive on the boat? If that's the case, how would animals survive on the boat? How? What's the case? I mean, like, so what I'm saying is, a lot of these, like, the logic behind some of these things doesn't always add up. They don't always add up, and it's really it's really up to us to, like, do the research, do the math on it. Let's do the math on what slavery was. Like, it was when we went after looking at what we just did. We have to understand the slavery of the Atlantic slave Holocaust was between indigenous people and the Africans. The indigenous, dark skinned, melanated people of the Americas with the Aboriginal indigenous people of Africa. And I'm not gonna even get into the slave trade in other areas because I mean, like, we particularly was talking about the Africans, the transatlantic slave trade. But I really want you guys to think about what was going on in South Africa, what was going on in North Africa, like all the trading of slaves going on. Period. Let me try to see if I can pull this up. Let me try to see if I can pull this up. It was one. I'm trying to see, but um, all I'm saying is that there was a lot of trading going on. Period. Like, I'm trying to think of this movie. The movie with Holly Berry, Tom Hanks. Um, it was like about time. Like, they were going back and forth in time, reincarnating, these things of that nature. If you guys remember that movie, put it in the comment section because I can't remember the name of that movie. But if anybody watched that movie, um, they had scenes where they were like they were like in like Malaysia somewhere, right? They were in Malaysia, and these British colonizers was in was in on these islands enslaving the people. And when you looked at these people, they looked like they were Africans. You thought you were in somewhere in a American slavery. You would have thought you was in America. You would have thought you was in the United States, and it was going on, but it wasn't. It was in, like I said, somewhere in like Malaysia, Indonesia, somewhere over there in that movie, right? And it just made me understand that, when these different colonializers went across the world, okay, when they went across the world, anytime they encountered dark skinned indigenous people, they basically categorized them all the same, and that they were heathen. They because they had similar practices, they had similar looks sometimes, and so they just kind of clumped everybody all around the world as heathen, and they would enslave them. And so I would, it would be interesting because you would have people in, like I said, Malaysia or Indonesia that got enslaved, right? And they say that the British Empire the sun never set on the British Empire. And so, with that being said, you realize that these, Europeans could trade you from one place to another, from one, like from Indonesia, Australia, anywhere. Anybody that's dark and they enslave you, they might send you to another part of the world. They might send you to another part of the world. So when we talk about like indigenous people being sent, yeah, indigenous people from America, they was being sent to other places in the world, just like Africans was being sent to other places in the world, just like dark skinned melanated people from, like I said, Malaysia or Indonesia or Philippines or any of them places. All these people were enslaved and shipped out somewhere else. It's not hard, and it makes more sense that they would ship you out from your homeland because they want to put you in a strange environment. Usually, the best thing to do is take take somebody out of their environment and put them in another place because it's easier to subdue them and it's easier to enslave you when you're not in your country. If you still in your terrain, you still feel a sense of pride at home. So it can be even a little bit more difficult to actually enslave, you know, a people when they still in their, land or or know the land. So it makes sense that they would mix them up everywhere. You understand what I'm saying? So I just want you guys to understand what is really, going on. What's really going on? I don't like the division between the indigenous people, melanated, and the melanated African descent. It has caused such a division among us in America because at the end of the day, we all are pretty much in the same position in life, and we have pretty much the same discriminatory principles, actions that are against both of us, whether we call ourselves indigenous, Moorish, or black. Okay, we are still subjugated in the same way. So, and from my perspective, it is important for us to have to, like, whatever happened with the indigenous enslavement needs to be considered and added to the problems and conditions. Because if the indigenous people who look just like me and claim they're indigenous and have been enslaved, then it needs to be addressed with the African centered people. Because there's a lot of, of course, there's a lot of African, Afrocentric, pro black, pan Africanists who understand, like, as pan Africanism, that people all around the world that's dark skinned need to come together. So, with that being said, even with the indigenous people here in America, they would fit into the Pan Africanist view of being all one and having the same story of enslavement and discrimination, racism, subjugation. All these things all are part of us. So that's why it's really important for us not to um, divide among ourselves because of what we're being teaching. So you got, like I said, like, let's, for example, like Dane Calloway. Um, and sometimes he's cool, but he does make these very broad, blanketed, um, you know, notions that like that we are not African. He claimed he purely like none of us that are dark skinned melanated that like none of us could be melanated from Africa. None of us could be African. We all got to be from here because of the group of melanated people that were here and how they were their stuff was taken from them as well. It's like the indigenous people that were dark skinned, they lost their sense of identity because they was forced to take on a false identity. And so were the Africans who were brought to America. They were forced into a false identity. So what has happened is the European American, the Anglo Saxon, basically clumped all dark skinned people into being black, right? Just like just like he clumped all of the European countries as white. So, for example, you know, you got the Anglo Saxons who basically established the United States. Okay, you know, but these other Europeans migrated into the United States over the past 200 years. Okay, so we had like you would see, with the exception of the French. The French were pretty much Americans was cool with them, but like when you looked at like Eastern Europeans coming into America, they were classified as different. Or if you look at the Irish, right? The Irish was looked at as lower. So you have these other groups. If you weren't pretty much an Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right, you would be looked down as a second-class citizen in the United States. And the the fact that once once the European American, once he began to like classify and put people into different categories, colors, he made all of the Europeans, he wound up making them white. And he made all of the dark skinned people in America, he made them black. And he labeled them black. And so that's what we have as a problem, is that the melanated people in America have been categorized as like what Brother Pleasant Bay would often say in his book, that they are sardines. So they clumped all these fish together and labeled them under a fictitious title of being a sardine. Many people didn't know that a sardine are really a whole or several different species of tiny fish that have they're different, but they clumped them all and renamed them. And that's what happened to the dark skinned melanated people that's in America today. Anybody who's dark skinned with certain features will be classified as a fictitious entity that they call black, Negro, or color. And that is the problem. So there's nothing being wrong with being indigenous, and there's nothing wrong with being a Moor. There's nothing wrong with being from Africa, because we all across the world have been mixed up and and basically put into a secondary, a submissive role in the world. And there's got to be unification among us. And I think a lot of a way to keep us divided is to put this disinformation out there. It's like, oh, we're indigenous and we're not part of Africa. So it really makes people feel like that being from Africa is wrong, or that a lot of times people feel like you got like you would be anything but want to be African, because being African has always been looked down upon. And like I said, I'm not saying that there's not Native Americans that were dark skinned because we know that, but to say that we all are Native American is maybe like not always factual. That's all I'm saying. It's like based on the information we had, there was millions of blacks, excuse me, millions of Africans that were brought here. Based on you guys go back and watch the video. If you guys are just tuning in or tuned in late, just go back and look at the data. Look at the countries. It's like, dude, be logical. You tell, I mean, like we got three or 400 years of slavery of groups of people bringing ships over here. Could it was it 800 million? I don't. I'm not here to say that that the exact number of Africans that were brought here, but I will say that there was millions of Africans brought over here. That's all I can. That's where I'm at. There was millions of Africans brought over here, and there were millions of indigenous people that were already here, and many of the Africans mixed with the indigenous natives. And the indigenous natives already had a relationship with Africans because Africans had been coming over here before Christopher Columbus. And the fact that the first inhabitants on the land of America were melanated dark people, okay, from my opinion, based on the DNA, they were brought from, they came from ultimately out of Africa. I know people like, oh, here we go. But I'm just saying, even with, like, my whole thing is this: even if we look at the out of African theory, the melanated man, the African man, traveled outside the world before any other race of people did. And they got to America long before the Mongoloid Asian type Native American appeared. And to me, that's all that matters. It's not about, oh, we was here from the beginning. I mean, like, it doesn't matter if we was here from the beginning or not. I mean, like, as long as we was here first. That's, to me, it's like the semantics of it all. It's like we'll divide and separate over the fact that we say that we weren't here from the beginning versus that we came here 20,000 years before any other body got here. Like, I feel like if the melanated people got here, let's say 20 or 40, 50,000 years ago, if they got here like 50,000 years ago, they beat all other group of people over here by a long shot. They've been here. This, if anybody can claim the land, it'd be the it'd be the dark skinned melanated people that came here first. First, like it's like it's like we look at all these other groups of people from, like, in different countries, they're dark skinned. We look at, like we said, we look at the Aborigine of Australia. We look at the dark skinned people of Indonesia. We look at the dark skinned people of Malaysia. We look at that whole area, right, in the Pacific. We look at the dark skinned people in Hawaii, right? Like, if you look at the people in Hawaii, dark skinned. I mean, we've seen all this evidence from from all our scholars. Even if you watch Hidden Colors, they show this. They show this on Hidden Colors, right? So it's not a far fetched idea that dark skinned people from around the globe inhabited the planet, the planet before any other race was either developed, existed, or was able to um, make that transition. Okay, so we know that there was dark skinned people here in America, but we do all. But the fact is, we do know that these Albions brought Africans over here to do the job as well, because they come into themselves and they were in the age of exploration and exploitation through their religious system of Catholicism, right? And later, Protestants, right? That those groups of Christians, Freemasons, okay, religious orders, secret societies, were able to create a superpower, if you will, in various European countries in a time where melanated people were bickering among themselves, and they were able to take advantage of that situation and able to capitalize on that. So I'm not. I mean, I'm done. I'm not gonna go too much further in it, y'all. Like I said, I hope y'all like the video. Do the research. Say what you will. Um, if you guys don't believe me when I'm on, I do understand the indigenous side. Y'all go back and watch the first video I ever made. Y'all look at the first videos we ever made. You will understand what side I've seen and where I've had to even from that point, I had to come from there. Like everything that we said back then, I had to reevaluate and look at it from a more scholarly perspective, even with that. Because like I'm not gonna get into it, but like the Homo sapien, you know, and other species of man has to be looked at and taken into consideration. So I'm not like I said, that's for another video. I'm gonna get out of here. I'm not gonna keep y'all all night, man. It's late already, man. We about to go and watch something on TV. So peace and love to everybody. Please check out the other videos, like and subscribe, and I'm gonna catch you on this next video, right? So peace.